questions without notice. The Leader of the Opposition.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. Can the Prime Minister confirm that his government told the media of his Jerusalem embassy announcement before it told the acting chief of the Australian Defence Force, or indeed told a single official from the Department of Foreign Affairs? And can the Prime Minister confirm the first discussion he had with his Foreign Minister about moving the embassy, a major foreign policy decision, was just 48 hours before the announcement?
The Prime Minister has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. What the government has done,
The Treasurer.
has
The Prime Minister has the
what
call.
the government has done has initiated two processes. The government has made no decisions on these policies. The government has done two things, apart from voting no in the United Nations General Assembly, together with the United States and Israel, on the matter before the General Assembly last week, Mr Speaker. What I indicated last week was that we would initiate two processes. The first was to review without prejudice the Iran nuclear deal, and that process is now underway, and that is chaired by the Deputy Secretary of the Department of Prime Minister and Cabinet. And on the other matter, we dared ask the question, Mr Speaker. We dared ask the question. We dared consider that Australia might have a different position on this issue, and we are initiating a process on that matter as well, which will fully consult all those who would need to be consulted before a final decision is made. Now, Mr Speaker, the Leader of the Labor Party may not think it's okay for governments to consult with each other and
Prime
dare ask a
will
question.
resume his seat. The Leader of the Opposition on a point of order.
On direct relevance, Mr Speaker, I was asking you about the timing of this Rush decision, and is it correct that he told the media before he informed the colleagues or indeed spoke to his own departmental or defence officials?
The Prime Minister has the call.
Mr Speaker, I consulted with all the ministers of the National Security Committee before I indicated one simple thing, and that is that I found the arguments of the Liberal candidate for Wentworth, the former ambassador to Israel, Dave Sharma, who had put forward a very, I think, convincing proposition that in advancing a two-state solution that we could also consider the possibility of recognising the capital of Israel being Jerusalem. And, Mr Speaker, I don't resolve from that. All I know is that the Australian people know where we stand on these issues, and as always, they have not the faintest idea about where the Labor Party stands. As far as I know, they all think Israel is a rogue state, just like the Deputy Leader of the Labor Party.
Members on my left, the member for Retiree has the call.
Thanks, Mr Speaker. My question's to the Prime Minister. Will the Prime Minister please update the House on how the government is acting to keep the Australian economy strong, and how would a reckless approach to economic management put our economy at risk?
The Prime Minister has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. I thank very much the member for Retiree for his question and his commitment to economic policies that are keeping our economy strong so we can guarantee the essential services that Australians rely on. Under our government, unemployment has fallen to 5%. Wow. There are 60,000 fewer people on unemployment today than there was at the last election, Mr Speaker. 350,000 jobs were created last year, and that includes 100,000 jobs for young Australians, the strongest year in youth employment growth than we have seen on economic record in this country. We've had the lowest budget deficit for 2017-18 that we've seen in a decade, and the government's plans are ensuring that the budget is coming back, projected into surplus next year, 1 year ahead of schedule. And what we also know is that the early read on the 18-19 results, Mr Speaker, for the September quarter shows that our position is $9 billion better off than what I was able to announce in the budget of this year, which says one thing also, that we are on track to deliver a balanced budget next year, Mr Speaker, 1 year ahead of what we had originally proposed to do as a government. And that means our AAA credit rating has been affirmed. It has been affirmed, and in addition today we know that Fitch Ratings Agency has also affirmed that AAA credit rating once again. These are the results of sound economic management and sound economic policies, but it is also true that there were 100,000 first homeowners who got back into the housing market last year. That is the best result in 8 years, Mr Speaker. The best result in 8 years. Young people being able to buy homes, getting back into the housing market, the best we've seen in 8 years, Mr Speaker, and as a share of all new credit in the housing market, the best since 2012, getting up above 18%. That's what our economic policies and economic management is delivering for the Australian people. Now, Labor's reckless taxes and their reckless approach to electricity prices mean this. They won't take a big stick to the electricity companies, but they will take a big stick to the value of your home, Mr Speaker. That's what they will do with their reckless policies, abolishing negative gearing as we know it and increasing capital gains tax. They're quite happy to get the big stick out on the homeowners, Mr Speaker, but when it comes to the big stick that we say should be applied to the big electricity companies to bring them into line, they drop it. They walk away. They cower under the table, Mr Speaker. So homeowners know that we've got their back. Homeowners paying electricity prices know we've got their back, Mr Speaker. But on that side of the House, we know this. They won't stand up to the big electricity companies. What they want to do is reach into the pockets of Australians, clawing back more and more tax because they do not know how to run a strong economy.
Members on both sides. Member for Griffith. Again, the member for Corio.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Defence. When did the Minister or his office first advise the Acting Chief of the Defence Force of the government's announcement on Jerusalem?
The Minister for Defence.
Thank you, Mr Speaker, and I thank the Shadow Minister for Defence for his question. It could be his first question to me as the Minister for Defence. I have, as he would know, I have almost daily conversations with the Secretary of Defence and quite often, not quite daily, but certainly 2 or 3 times a week with the Chief of the Defence Force, and I'm not in the habit of revealing those conversations to the House.
The member for New England.
Well, thank you very much, Mr Speaker. Mr Speaker, my question is to the Treasurer of the Commonwealth of Australia. Will the Treasurer outline to the House the importance of a strong economy and how the housing market is important to hard-working Australian families? How would a reckless approach to taxation put our economy at risk?
The Treasurer has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker, and I thank the member for New England for his question. And he knows that the Australian economy is growing strongly. And you don't have to take my word for it. Today, Fitch, one of the world's leading credit rating agencies, reaffirmed Australia's AAA credit rating, Mr Speaker. And this comes on the back of 3.4% GDP growth through the year, the fastest rate of growth since 2012 and the height of the mining boom. This comes on the back of unemployment numbers last week at 5%, the best since 2012. This comes on the back of a budget which is on track to come back to balance a year earlier than expected in 2019-20, and this comes on the back of Standard & Poor's, again reaffirming our AAA credit rating agency. But, Mr Speaker, all this good work is at risk from a Labor Party that wants to tax you from the cradle to the grave, Mr Speaker. A Labor Party with 5 big new taxes: taxes on your income, taxes on your business, taxes on your electricity, taxes on your savings and taxes on your property, Mr Speaker, with changes to negative gearing and capital gains, Mr Speaker. Now, today the Labor Party frontbenchers and backbenchers have been tying themselves in knots over the negative gearing policy. Even though it was released 2 years ago, they don't know when it starts, they don't know how it works, and they don't know what the impact will be on the value of the family home and on people's rents, Mr Speaker. Now, the Leader of the Opposition tells us that if you reduce negative gearing, property prices will go down, Mr Speaker. But what does the member for Rankin, the Shadow Finance Minister, tell us today? Teary, Mr Speaker. The member for Kleenex, what does he tell us? The member for Rankin said today that under Labor's negative gearing policy, housing prices will go up, Mr Speaker. Prices goes up.
Members on my right.
Then the member for Hunter. in that famous interview with the member for New England, the member for Hunter, he says under Labor's negative gearing policy, prices won't go up or down, Mr Speaker. He wants it both ways, Mr Speaker. No wonder the member for New England said that the member for Hunter has no clue, Mr Speaker. The reality is, under Labor's policy and their changes to negative gearing, the value of your house will go down. Your rent will go up, Mr Speaker. And the member for Lilly, when he was Treasurer of Australia, said it would be economically reckless to change negative gearing, economically disastrous to change negative gearing, but this Labor Party, desperate for revenue, is taking a sledgehammer to the family home.
The member for Corio.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister.
You're off the hook.
The Prime Minister has previously stated in question time that his Jerusalem embassy announcement was discussed at Cabinet. How did Defence have time to contribute coordinating comments to a Cabinet submission if the government was running to a media timetable instead of a proper Cabinet process? Is this government so hopelessly divided that a media timetable and a by-election panic takes precedence over a considered process?
The Prime Minister has the
Thank
call.
you, Mr Speaker. I reject the assertions put forward by the member's question. What the government has done has said quite clearly, and this matter was discussed at Cabinet, Mr Speaker, the simple point we've made is we are looking at the question of whether the government would move to recognise Jerusalem as the capital of Israel. That's what we said we have done. And we are open to that question, and I was quite persuaded by the arguments put forward by the former ambassador to Israel, Dave Sharma, Mr Speaker, who made a very compelling case. What I find interesting about the opposition's questions is they tie themselves up in the Canberra bubble of process, Mr Speaker, all the time, but they are not prepared to address the question of substance. And the question of substance is this. Why does the Leader of the Labor Party object to even considering the possible relocation of our embassy to Jerusalem? And why will he not even consider the recognition of Jerusalem as the capital of Israel? Is he so tied up, Mr Speaker, in the division of the ranks of those opposite, where one of their members says quite openly that Israel is a rogue state, but the member for Melbourne Ports claims that he says that he would be very in favour of such a change. Now, Mr Speaker, we're prepared to ask those questions. We're prepared to consider these questions. The Leader of the Labor Party doesn't know what he thinks.
Leader of the House. Just before I call the member for Mayo, I'm going to let the member for Isaacs know that I warned him several interjections ago. The member for Griffith is also warned, as is the member for Braddon and the member for McEwen, who interject constantly through question time. They are not going to disrupt question time today. The member for Mayo has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Health. Minister, I have appreciated your open door to discuss health issues relevant to my electorate of Mayo. Would you please provide an update with respect to the possible expansion of headspace services in Mount Barker, Strathalbyn and Victor Harbour? And secondly, would you please provide details of the government's commitment to fund $20 million to improve drug rehabilitation services to South Australia with a dedicated facility in Mayo?
The Minister for Health.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker, and I want to thank the member for Mayo. On a number of occasions now we've discussed the issues both of mental health and also of drug rehabilitation and drug services within her electorate and within country South Australia more generally. And we know that there is a challenge. The national suicide rate is approximately 11.8 per 100,000. Sadly, as challenging as that is, it's even higher, at about 13.9 per 100,000 in country South Australia. And so that, of course, includes the vast bulk of Mayo and Mayo residents. Importantly, the government has been investing very significantly, almost $100 million a year, in in Headspace and across South Australia. We've added a new service in Whyalla. We've expanded our service to Mount Barker. And we've also added new psychological services across the Fleurieu Peninsula and across the Adelaide Hills. Going forwards, we've also, and the Prime Minister went to South Australia to announce an additional $51 million for Headspace, of which $39 million will be directly related to Headspace services and centres around the country. That could include the potential, and I am working with the member specifically on this question, for capital facilities in relation to the Mount Barker area, where $6 million is available. But we are also looking at the expansion of outreach, as has been proposed in other areas of country South Australia by the member for Barker and the member for Grey. The member for Sturt has been a very important advocate as one of the founders of Headspace across Australia. And so we are looking at that, and I am very hopeful that we'll be able to achieve something. The case is strong. They accept that given the very tragic suicide rates and the youth mental health challenges we face. And in addition, we are looking at expanding outreach services. I know that the member for Indi also has very significant challenges in relation to Wangaratta, in the same way that we've been able to work with Grafton and with Lithgow, where there have been spikes in suicide due to what are sometimes called suicide clusters. In relation to drug and alcohol rehabilitation, we announced $40 million at the budget. Indeed, the Prime Minister announced that as part of his budget work, $20 million will go to education, focused on South Australia for drug and alcohol rehab, but $20 million will be released for public grants by the 30th of November. We will be calling for contributions for areas of need, projects that will make a tangible difference, whether it's in a drug rehabilitation service, a drug and alcohol outreach program, things that will literally have the potential to save lives and protect lives. I'll be inviting all South Australian members to work with their community to apply for those, and I thank the member for her sincere focus on this.
The member for Dawson.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Deputy Prime Minister, Minister for Infrastructure, Transport and Regional Development. How is the government backing hard-working Australians in rural and regional Australia? How would a reckless approach to regional Australia put regional economies at risk?
The Deputy Prime Minister has the call.
Yeah, thank you, Mr Speaker, and I thank the member for Dawson for his question. And you can see how they start yelling whenever a member talks about regional Australia, because those opposite have a reckless approach to regional Australia. They don't care. They don't have any policies about regional Australia. Completely reckless. Completely reckless. Now we back those who are having a go with tax relief on your income, on your business, and indeed working hard to bring down power bills. We understand that Australians work hard and we want to back them, and we are backing them. When we cut income tax, Labor, what they do, they voted against it. When we cut small business tax, Labor voted against it. They postured. They backflipped. They waited. Yes, that's right, they did, member for McMahon. Now they're plotting tax rises. You did, as far as the eye can see, on your business, on your property, on your income, on your electricity bill, and bringing the big sledgehammer. It's that way, Prime Minister, not always that way, it's that way that Labor wants to do it. Bringing the big sledgehammer, to retiree savings, such as Jolyon Forsyth. Now he's 88. He lives in Mackay. His wife Enid is 84. They're retirees who've worked hard, who've saved hard, who use those franking credits for that holiday, that painting of the house, that little bit of extra money. They've saved their money, they've invested in fully franked shares so they can take advantage of no double taxation on the dividends. Taxable income in 26-17 was around $72,000, so they don't consider themselves wealthy. Now, under Labor's policies of smashing retirees' savings, yes, that's right, they will miss out on an imputation refund of around $11,000, which means a lot of money to their income and their lifestyle. It's enough to make the member for Rankin, wherever he's gone, cry. It's enough to make him even cry. Now, there he is. He's just back in now. Now, Jolyon only stopped earning a salary at the age of 85. He's never, ever claimed a pension. Now, these are the people we back. These are the people we support. These are the people Labor want to take the big sledgehammer to. They want to whack them. They want to absolutely, recklessly...
The Deputy Prime Minister. I haven't called you yet. The Leader of the House. Leader of the House. Manager of Opposition Business on a point of order.
Just drawing on your role for the dignity of the parliament. I know that we have with us today in the gallery the cast and crew of the Wharf Review, but the wild gestures and auditions that are going on from those opposite is just plain weird.
Manager of Opposition Business. I haven't called the Deputy Prime Minister yet. The Manager of Opposition Business makes a reasonable point of order. Could he lean across and remind the member for McMahon? The Deputy Prime Minister has the call.
He takes the interjection because he knows that it hurts. He knows that it's going to hurt. He does. He knows that it's going to hurt retirees, and you want to keep smashing them. Keep smashing them all. I tell you what's weird is the way that you want to attack retirees, such as those in Mackay, such as those in Dawson, such as those right around the nation. You want to take away that little bit of extra income. I don't know why you want to do it, but you want to do it. And it's going to cost you votes. It's going to cost you the election. It is, absolutely. Now, we won't be reckless. We won't, because every retiree knows that they shouldn't vote Labor.
Member for McMahon.
You're going to take their money away.
Members on both sides. The Deputy Leader of the Opposition.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister and it relates to his embassy announcement. Can he confirm there was no cabinet coordination process? The Foreign Minister wasn't told until 48 hours before. The acting
Deputy
chief
Leader
of
of
the
the Opposition
ADF
will pause for a second. Members on my right are preventing me hearing the question. The Deputy Leader of the Opposition will begin her question again.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister and it relates to his embassy announcement. Can he confirm there was no cabinet coordination process? The Foreign Minister wasn't told until 48 hours before. The acting chief of the ADF found out about it after the media, and confidential messages with Indonesia and ASIO briefings were leaked. If this is what we get from the Muppet Show during a by-election, what sort of chaotic, divided and unstable performance is this government planning for the general election?
The Prime Minister.
Well, thank you, Mr Speaker. Cabinet processes I wouldn't go into in a public forum such as this, Mr Speaker.
Members on
what
my
I make very clear is the government has not made a decision in relation to the recognition of Jerusalem as the capital of Israel. The government has not made a decision on that. What I simply said was that I was persuaded by the arguments that were made by the former ambassador to Israel from Australia, Dave Sharma, about the case he was putting forward, and that we would be posing that question and we would be consulting on that question with a view down the track to making a decision. And we will follow the full process that would be necessary to go through to come to a decision on that matter. The opposition doesn't seem to understand the difference between a decision of a government and a question that is being posed, Mr Speaker. And that is the clear distinction that has been made. But the Leader of the Opposition and the Deputy Leader of the Opposition raised questions in relation to what can be expected in the future, Mr Speaker. Well, I can tell you what can be expected in the future if the Labor leader becomes the Prime Minister of this country. $200 billion of reckless taxes on the Australian economy. He won't stand up to big electricity companies. He won't take a big stick to electricity companies to ensure that customers get the right deal from electricity companies. He won't do that, but he will take a big stick to the house prices of Australians. And we've had 100,000 young home buyers and other home buyers get back into the market in the last year, the best result we've seen in 8 years. And what he wants to do to every single one of those is take a big stick to their house prices with the reckless tax that he wants to impose by abolishing negative gearing as we know it and increasing capital gains tax by 50%. Now, Mr Speaker, the Labor Party has form on reckless taxes and they impose them at the worst possible time, if
Member
there's
for
ever
Lawless
a
Ward.
good time. But, Mr Speaker, it was the member for Lilly, when he was Treasurer, who decided it was a cracking idea to apply a mining tax just as the mining industry was turning and to accelerate it, Mr Speaker, and accelerate its decline. And now the Labor Party think it's a cracking idea to attack homeowners by applying a big fat tax on housing as the housing market has softened, Mr Speaker. So what you can expect from the Labor Party in the future, if they were to occupy these benches, is, Mr Speaker, a tax on homeowners with higher taxes, a tax on retirees with higher taxes, a tax on wage earners with higher and reckless taxes on them, Mr Speaker, a tax on retirees who had the simple strategy of owning Australian shares, and they would live off the dividend imputation credits which they are entitled to, because Australians shouldn't have to pay tax twice, Mr Speaker.
The member for Boothby.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Mr Speaker,
Members on my left. The member for Boothby has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Treasurer. Will the Treasurer update the House on measures the government is taking to protect Australia's AAA credit rating and manage the nation's finances? How would a reckless approach to managing the budget put the AAA credit rating at risk?
The Treasurer has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker, and I thank the member for Boothby for her question, because she, like all members on this side of the House, is working hard to grow the Australian economy, Mr Speaker. An economy that is growing at 3.4% through the year, its fastest rate since the height of the mining boom. An economy where we've seen more than 1.1 million new jobs being created, Mr Speaker. An economy where our budget is on track to come back to balance a year earlier than expected. And today, we heard from Fitch, one of the leading credit rating agencies in the world, reaffirm our AAA credit rating, Mr Speaker. And what they said in their report was that they praised the government for its sustained spending restraint, Mr Speaker, for its budget repair strategy, and forecast that we would return to surplus as expected. But Finch also had some words to say about the housing market, Mr Speaker, and while they said that there is now an orderly transition, they did warn of a sharp decline, Mr Speaker. And what would cause a sharp decline, Mr Speaker? A larger pullback from investor demand, Mr Speaker. A larger pullback from investor demand. And what has Standard & Poor's said? Very similar.
Treasurer will just pause. The member for Lawler will leave under 94A. The Treasurer has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Standard & Poor's have said a similar thing, that Australia's AAA rating could come under pressure if house prices fall sharply, Mr Speaker, and that would increase risks to fiscal accounts, to real economic growth and financial stability. But, Mr Speaker, what is going to lead to a sharp decline in house prices, Mr Speaker? What is going to lead to a sharp decline in house prices? It's Labor's property tax, Mr Speaker. It's Labor's changes to negative gearing and capital gains, Mr Speaker. Because under Labor's new property tax, if you own your home, it will be worth less. And under Labor's new property tax, if you rent your home, you'll be paying more, Mr Speaker. Under Labor, you'll always pay more, Mr Speaker, and the value of your house will be less. So, Mr Speaker, these reckless taxes from the Labor Party are putting in danger our AAA credit rating. And if we were to lose our AAA credit rating, our cost of borrowing would be higher. The state's cost of borrowing would be higher, Mr Speaker, and Australians would be paying more for everyday costs across the economy, Mr Speaker. Now, the member for McMahon has just said in the last couple of days this is exactly the right time to reduce negative gearing. That's what he said. But what we're hearing from the experts, the Master Builders Association, Riskwise, Citigroup, Finch, Mr Speaker, Standard & Poor's, is don't risk the housing market, don't risk the property market. Only the coalition can be trusted to keep the value in your home and trusted to keep your rents lower.
The member for Eden-Monaro.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Defence Industry. Is the minister aware that yesterday at Senate estimates his own department couldn't say what his job was? And additionally, the Minister for Foreign Affairs commented, it's fair to say I'm enjoying this. And his own department had to take the question on notice. Is this just another example of what Australians can expect from a government which the Prime Minister has described as the Muppet Show?
Members on my left, the Minister for Defence Industry.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker. And you know, the extraordinary thing about the Australian Labor Party on this issue is that they don't even have a Minister for Defence Industry. The Australian Labor Party has no track record at all when it comes to investing in the build-up of Australia's defence capability. The Australian Labor Party lacks any goodwill at all, frankly, when it comes to making sure that the billions of dollars that the coalition is expending in the defence portfolio goes towards creating jobs, investing in science, technology, engineering and mathematics of young Australians coming through, investing in advanced manufacturing, and most importantly, making sure we have a pipeline of investment in the next generation of capability for the men and women that serve in the Australian Defence Force. That's the contrast between the coalition, the Liberal and National Party with our pipeline of investment, and the Australian Labor Party. Because these guys, Mr Speaker, they're much more interested in being involved in the Canberra bubble. They're much more interested in playing games around politics than they are in knowing the facts about what our Defence Force is doing.
The Minister will resume his seat. The member for Grayndler on a point of order.
Absolutely, Mr Speaker. It goes to direct relevance for the member for Eden Monaro's question. Perhaps he could ask the minister. Could ask the Minister for Defence to add to his answer.
The member for Grayndler will resume his seat. The Minister for Defence Industry has the call. He's in order.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker. The simple fact is that, as I said, the Liberal and National Party will keep investing in defence capability. We'll keep investing in Australia's defence industry, and most importantly, we will make sure the men and women of Australia's Defence Force come home safely, because we're prepared to invest in safeguarding them, creating jobs in Australia and making sure our defence industry is strong. But because it's clearly beyond the shadow minister opposite, let me make it clear. Maybe you've got your smartphone in front of you. You might want to punch in www.minister.defence.gov.au, because you'll see there's a full list of responsibilities there.
Members on my left.
Of responsibilities there. So if it's far beyond you to know what it is, I suggest you have a look. But more importantly than that, what I'd say to the Australian Labor Party is that you need to take seriously the Australian defence industry. You need to invest in capability, because your track record is shameful. For 6 years, the Australian Labor Party did not commission a single new vessel for Australia. For 6 years, you failed to invest in Australian jobs. For 6 years, you failed to take seriously what we're doing in the defence industry. We've corrected the record. We've made sure that we've got the defence industry back on track. We're creating jobs. We're investing $200 billion, and we are making sure that under our watch we won't go back to the lowly and miserly 1.38% of GDP that existed under the Australian Labor Party. So you stand condemned for 6 years of inaction, and we stand proud beside the men and women of the Australian Defence Force.
The members on both sides will cease interjecting. The Manager of Opposition Business on a point of order.
I'd ask the minister to table the document that he referred to, which apparently his department doesn't have.
Was the minister quoting from a confidential document? No, he didn't. No, in fairness to the minister, no, he didn't quote from it, so that he didn't. No, we're moving on. We're moving on. The member for Robertson.
Thank you, Mr Speaker.
What are statesmen doing?
The member for Robertson has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. And my question is to the Minister for Energy. Will the minister update the House on what action the government is taking to bring down power prices? How would a reckless approach of failing to hold the energy companies to account push up energy prices?
The Minister for Energy.
Well, I thank the hard-working member for her question. Now, on Tuesday this week, we announced our plan for affordable, reliable power, which will help families and businesses up and down the Central Coast, including in the members' electorate of Robertson. Our plan will reduce prices by stopping the price gouging with our big stick legislation, which we'll be bringing to the parliament later this year. A fair price safety net for customers who don't get around to negotiating will be in place by 1st of July next year, with a down payment for all customers on the 1st of January. Now, Mr Speaker, we're backing investment in reliable generation with a short list of projects by early next year. And from July 1, we'll require energy companies to commit to invest years ahead to make sure they've got the affordable, reliable capacity in place to serve Australian customers. Now, Mr Speaker, the AEMC found that customers on standing offers could be paying up to $832 more per year than alternative market offers. Small businesses could be paying up to almost $3,500 more. This loyalty tax is outrageous. Two houses or two businesses side by side with exactly the same energy usage, and one can be paying thousands more than the other. Mr Speaker, the rip-offs have to stop. Now, the member asked about alternatives. Well, this morning the AFR announced that Labor will side with the big energy companies, their big rip-offs and their record profits. Mr Speaker, the Shadow Minister doesn't come into question time armed with questions for me. He comes armed with a toothpick, and that is his position. That's his position. He just wants to take a toothpick to the big energy companies so they can keep their prices high and keep their record profits. As I've said from the beginning, my single focus is to get prices down for Australian families and businesses, and if we need to use a big stick, we will do it.
Member for Jellybrand and the member for Lyons. Member for Jellybrand is warned. Deputy Leader of the Opposition.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. Is he aware that the first former Prime Minister in this government, the member for Warringah, has said about the third and current Prime Minister's decision to send the second former Prime Minister in this government, Malcolm Turnbull, to Bali to represent Australia? He said, and I quote, "Doesn't matter how exalted a private citizen might be, you can really only speak for the government if you're a minister." Does the Prime Minister agree? Is he reconsidering sending Malcolm Turnbull as his envoy?
The Prime Minister has the call. The member for Barara.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Senior Australians and Aged Care. Will the minister update the House on how the government is helping retirees and pensioners earn more and live better? How would a reckless approach of denying retirees their dividend credits put the livelihoods of self-funded retirees at risk?
The Minister for Senior Australians and Aged Care.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. I thank the member for Barara for his question and his ongoing interest in senior Australians. What we're doing as a government is we are carefully managing the economy. We're building the strength of the economy so that we're able to reinvest back into programs and services for senior Australians, the aged care sector and for society in general. By carefully managing the economy, it encourages people to invest in blue-chip shares, to invest in a range of other opportunities such as new houses, and realise a dividend for themselves. So when they retire, they have a source of income. And I want to read to you an extract from a letter from Mr Hemsworth. He's a RAAF veteran, not eligible for a service pension, and was a tradesman who saved for his retirement but is set to lose more than 30% of his income if these changes go ahead. Let me read what he says. "It really pains me and makes me extremely angry to have to write to a political party for the first time. I should not have to protect my family from federal politicians who blatantly want to steal 31% of my hard-earned annual income, and it makes me sick to the stomach
Member for Deakin.
that you blokes
Member
who
for
have the best
Goldstein and member for
superannuation in the country want to steal from my super without a second thought. My crime is to be able to procure over many years shares in Australian companies that earn taxes, income for the country and employ many thousands of Aussies. These dividends allow me and my partner to live comfortably without any input from the public purse and have a very limited benefit from my one and only concession. He then goes on to say, if the excess franking refund is removed, then we lose $28,000 in actual income. It's about 31% of our real income, and this would reduce.
The minister will just pause for a second. The member for Shortland and the member for Deakin will leave under 94A and continue their conversation if they wish outside the chamber. The minister has the call.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It is only the middle-income earners and retirees that are affected. Let's call them aspirants, those that want to better their family circumstances and are willing to work hard, sacrifice personal spending, save and invest, take risks and wait for the many years it actually takes to build that modest nest egg that they need. I'm also surprised that a wannabe Treasurer of this country does not understand the implications of his ill-formed decision. The examples that were given by you were cherry-picked, bloated and a load of BS fodder for the uninformed. That was a letter that Mr Hemsworth wrote to both the member for Maribyrnong and the member for McMahon. It is about protecting and ensuring that their savings and their investments are protected and that the franking dividends that Labor has will destroy their dreams.
Has concluded.
Thank you.
The member for Hotham.
Mr Speaker, my question is to the Prime Minister. Last week, the Prime Minister told Parliament, and I quote, "What I believe today is what I will believe next week and what I will believe a month from now." Given that when he was Treasurer he believed a banking royal commission was a populist whinge and voted against it 26 times, doesn't this just prove that no matter what this Prime Minister says now, protecting the big banks and the top end of town is in his DNA?
The Prime Minister has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. I initiated the Royal Commission into the banking and financing industry. When you look up the terms of reference, you'll find my name on it.
Members on my left. The member for Rankin and the member for Kingston. The member for Kingston's warned. The member for Ryan has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question's to the Minister for Jobs, Industrial Relations and Women. Will the minister please update the House on what action the government is taking to crack down on militant unions, and what would a reckless approach that allows militant unions to run amok put at risk the rule of law in workplaces?
The Minister for Jobs, Industrial Relations and Women.
Thank you, Mr Speaker, and I thank the hard-working member for Ryan for her question. And given the terrific jobs figures that we have seen under the government's strong economic plan, more than 1.1 million new jobs created, I can understand precisely why she is concerned about militant and reckless unions. Because the member knows that militant unions who harbour militant lawbreakers are a threat to continuous and record jobs growth. That is why the government has taken very strong action to protect workers, to protect them from bullying and thuggery and intimidation by those militant union bosses. We have re-established the tough cop on the beat with the Australian Building and Construction Commission. We have established the Registered Organisations Commission, and we have legislation in the Senate right now that would stop workers' entitlement funds from being used as slush funds, and we would get rid of those dodgy union officials who would be dishonest in using those monies. And of course, we have a raft of legislation before the Senate that will protect workers' superannuation entitlements, would stop the rorts and the rip-offs that were created by the Leader of the Opposition when he actually served in the Treasury benches for those low-balance accounts. Now, these, of course, are very good and sensible reforms that will protect workers and will protect their hard-won and hard-earned entitlements. But not only do those opposite not support them, in fact, if they got a chance, they would get rid of them in their entirety, because they are under the thumb of the militant unions that the courts have said would place themselves above the law. Now, we have seen rallies right across the country this week by the self-proclaimed lawbreaker herself, Sally McManus. And who else did we see joining Sally McManus at these rallies, whether they be in Melbourne or other places? We have seen her stand next to that lawbreaker, John Secker himself, famous for assaulting police officers. But who else was there in Melbourne? Labor Premier Daniel Andrews, who not only endorsed the law-breaking and lawlessness agenda, but revealed that he has no respect for the rule of law either. We have seen under Daniel Andrews that the Victorian Labor Party, under his leadership, has rorted almost $400,000 from Victorian taxpayers to pay political operatives during the 2014 state election. And we now hear the Victorian Labor MPs will refuse to cooperate with police. Now, under Victorian law, we have seen under Victorian Labor the lawbreakers become the lawmakers, and under Bill Shorten it would be the same thing.
The Minister needs to refer to members by their correct titles. She needs to come back, withdraw what she said. She's doing this regularly.
Under the Leader of the Opposition, I withdraw.
Member for McMahon.
Thanks, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister and refers to his previous answer. Can the Prime Minister please tell the House about how the Banking Royal Commission was really all his idea?
Members on both sides. The Prime Minister has the call.
Mr Speaker, actions speak louder than words. In the 6 years they were in government, did they initiate a Royal Commission of the banking industry? Did they increase the penalties for offenders when it came to offences in the banking and financial industry, as Trio and all the other scandals which the Royal Commission are actually now examining, Mr Speaker, that happened on their watch? What action did they take, Mr Speaker? They took no action. They took no action at all. And under our government we have introduced the toughest laws for banking executives in this country ever and around the world, Mr Speaker. Under our government we introduced the toughest penalties, both personally and for the banks, that have ever been in place, Mr Speaker, and have been getting the results when the prosecutions have come before the courts. We have set up the Financial Complaints Authority, which means that banking and financial customers can get access to justice without having to have a truckload of lawyers going with them, Mr Speaker. And indeed, as Treasurer, I was the Treasurer that initiated the Royal Commission of the banking and financial industry. The Leader of the Opposition doesn't understand. The public pay on results, not words.
The member for Moore.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Home Affairs. Will the Minister update the House on the threat to Australia's borders posed by criminal people smuggling syndicates? How will a reckless approach to border protection put our borders at risk?
The Minister for Home Affairs.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker. I thank the honourable member for his question. As all Australians can recall, the fact is that when Labor was in government for 6 years, 50,000 people arrived on 800 boats and tragically 1,200 drowned at sea. Mr Speaker, Labor put into detention 8,000 children They put thousands of people on Manus and Nauru. And, Mr Speaker, we have worked day and night, every day since, to make sure that we've got all of the children out of detention here in Australia. We're doing the same on Nauru. We're very close to getting it to zero, and we will achieve, Mr Speaker, what Labor could never have imagined. If Labor was in government today, it's very clear that the boats would be flowing, Mr Speaker. They put forward this half-understood policy in relation to New Zealand, saying that everybody should come from Nauru to New Zealand. What they forgot, Mr Speaker, is that where there is a negative assessment in relation to the security of a particular individual, say a father within a family unit, they would compel that person to go from Nauru to New Zealand. Is New Zealand going to take that person? Of course they're not, Mr Speaker. Should Australia take that person if it's assessed by the United States or one of our Five Eyes partners or our intelligence agencies here that that individual is a threat to Australian security? Of course they shouldn't. But the Labor Party has come up with this policy which sends a green light to people smugglers, which would see children unaccompanied on boats coming to our country. We're seeing in the United States now, Mr Speaker, reports from people that have gone from Nauru to the United States that it's a bit harder than they thought because they need to find work in the United States. And they're saying to people on Nauru now, you'd be better to go to New Zealand or Australia because they've got a better welfare system. Now, Mr Speaker, are we going to create an environment where people smugglers are back in charge? That's exactly what they said. That is exactly what they've said, Mr Speaker. And do you think that the Labor Party has control of the internal machinations on this border protection policy? They don't. Mr Rudd and Ms Gillard lost control of our borders, and this Leader of the Opposition, if he is elected at the next election, will be on the same path as Rudd and Gillard. We will see kids back in detention, Mr Speaker. You will see kids back on Nauru. It's a policy of the Labor Party today that if a boat arrived, including a boat of women and children, that every single person would go to Nauru. So, Mr Speaker, why would we believe Labor? Why would we trust Labor when it comes to border protection? The Australian people cannot trust Labor. They are reckless on border protection policy, Mr Speaker. The fact is that New Zealand is a pull factor. The New Zealanders know it, Australians know it, and most importantly, Mr Speaker, the people smugglers know it.
The Leader of the Opposition.
Thanks, Mr Speaker. My questions to the Prime Minister I refer to his earlier answers. Prime Minister, if actions speak louder than words, why did you vote against a Banking Royal Commission on 26 separate times?
The Treasurer has to call. Members on both sides.
Doesn't know the difference between action and
Mr Speaker, let's remember, when Labor was last in office, there were financial scandals with Trio, with Opus Prime, with Storm Financial, Mr Speaker. Let's remember what the Leader of the Opposition said at the time, when he was the Financial Services Minister. He talked about the excellent regulatory system and prudent management, Mr Speaker. He talked about the sound regulatory system we have in place. He didn't call a Royal Commission when Labor was last in government. He sat tight when financial scandals occurred on his watch. In contrast, Mr Speaker, we have taken action, including this week, introducing legislation into the parliament to double the criminal penalties for white-collar crime, Mr Speaker, to increase by up to tenfold the penalties for civil penalties for white-collar crime, Mr Speaker. The accountability regime that we're putting inside banks, Mr Speaker. The new Deputy Chair of ASIC, Mr Speaker, the Special Prosecutor, Daniel Crennan QC, who will be a cop on the beat. The extra resourcing that we have provided to our regulators, Mr Speaker. The fact that we are taking action across the board and that we await the final report from the Hayne Royal Commission in February next year, Mr Speaker. Unlike the Labor Party, we don't think we know better than the Royal Commissioner. The Leader of the Opposition and his shadow ministers going around the country pretending that they know better than the Royal Commissioner, Mr Speaker. The Royal Commissioner has made plain and clear in his interim report that banks have put profits before people. We are taking action today. We'll continue to take the necessary action to put the consumers of Australia first.
The member for Calare.
My question is to the Deputy Prime Minister and Minister for Infrastructure, Transport and Regional Development. Will the minister update the House on how the government is supporting regional communities dealing with the drought through assistance to community groups and local councils?
The Deputy Prime Minister has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker, and I thank the member for Calare for his very serious question. Having a strong economy helps us invest in looking after country communities, which are doing it pretty tough at the moment, very tough indeed with the effects of the drought. To date, the government's investment has been more than $1.8 billion in drought assistance, and we are determined to play our role and to help with the assistance and recovery efforts. We recently announced $15 million in support for local community groups through the Foundation for Rural and Regional Renewal, a very, very good organisation. This morning we released the guidelines and applications open tomorrow. We want to support communities dealing with the drought. We want to get the money flowing into drought-affected communities to make sure that they have that income flowing around, to make sure that people know they are supported. There's the Drought Communities program, funding to 5 local shires in the Calare electorate, which is helping councils generate work and get money flowing, and to 55 others throughout Queensland, throughout New South Wales and throughout Victoria. And I appreciate, I acknowledge and I recognise too that South Australia is doing it tough as well. Now, through the FRRR, there's the investment into small community grants, which is also helped by philanthropic donations, and that's also helping too. And right around the nation, kids are giving up their pocket money, businesses are helping, people are supporting, and that is fantastic. But this is about investments for non-profit organisations to help such things as social gatherings, reduce social isolation, drought information sessions, forums, and as well as getting vital community gatherings for our rural and regional communities. Now, those eligible should visit the Foundation's website, frrr.org.au. We're seeing the best of regional Australia, the best of human nature, of people's goodwill, reveal itself during this crippling drought. Mr Speaker, the best from organisations such as Lifeline Central West. That's a fabulous organisation. It's led by Chief Executive Officer Stephanie Robinson. She's seen the effects of the drought firsthand, and her organisation is certainly getting in there and helping. Now, the member tells me that that organisation, Lifeline Central West, have been doing some fantastic work in the Calare electorate around the drought, including the development of a drought toolkit. They've also helped a number of drought toolkit talks around the region in Orange and Bathurst so far, which aim to equip people who are in regular contact with those affected by the drought. And tomorrow, of course, here in Canberra, we'll be having the Drought Summit, where we will meet with stakeholders and we will continue as a parliament, as a government, to stand shoulder to shoulder with people who are doing it very, very tough. Together, we will get through this drought. Our farmers, our rural communities are the most resilient people in this land, make no mistake. It's all about tackling tough times together. United as one, as a government, as a nation.
The member for Newcastle.
Thank you, Mr Speaker, and my question is to the Prime Minister. The Prime Minister told the Parliament what I believe today is what I believe next week and what I will believe in a month from now. Given, as Treasurer, he voted to support cutting penalty rates 8 times, does this prove that no matter what this Prime Minister says now, he'll always put the top end of town before working Australians?
The Prime Minister.
Well, Mr Speaker, first of all, the member is misinformed and is seeking to misrepresent what goes on in this place, Mr Speaker. What the government believes in is having the Fair Work Commission, which is an independent agency which determines wage matters in the Australian economy. The government does not believe that the Leader of the Labor Party and any politician should be setting people's wages. We don't believe they should, Mr Speaker. We believe in the independent process of the Commission, which was set up by the Leader of the Labor Party when he was in government. We do not think there should be the chaos, Mr Speaker, of people's wages being determined by the politics of politicians, Mr Speaker. We think there should be a certain and fair process where the issues can be considered and reasonable decisions can be determined, and workers and employers can get on about the job of growing our economy. Now, the Leader of the Labor Party wants to turn lawbreakers into lawmakers when it comes to industrial relations in this country. Union-bred, union-fed, union-led. That's what this Leader of the Labor Party would be if we were to be the Prime Minister of this country. We do not think that politicians should set people's pay. That should be done through a fair and independent process, and that's what we will support, Mr Speaker.
The member for Grey.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Agriculture and Water Resources. Will the Minister update the House on how the government is demonstrating our commitment to supporting farmers and their families by providing immediate assistance to help put food on the table and cover basic expenses during the drought?
The Minister for Agriculture.
Well, thank you, Mr Speaker, and can I thank the member for Grey for his question. In fact, I was in the electorate of Grey recently and attended the Jamestown show, where I was fortunate enough to do a Q&A in front of 200 farmers who actually expressed to me their concern about this cancer of this drought that continues to spread right across eastern Australia, now into South Australia. And they expressed to me their concern and their desire for the need for support for their families and their communities. And proudly, our government has lifted the Farm Household Assistance Program by $12,000. We're now putting $37,626 into families' pockets to make sure that their household expenses are being paid for, to give them the dignity and respect and the time to make decisions during this tough drought. We're supporting that by also making it more accessible, by extending the net asset test from $2.6 million to $5 million, to make sure those that are doing it hard right across the board are able to get this assistance in terms of household payments. But we've also made sure that we've understood that this drought has been prolonged more than anyone ever thought. We've extended the term from 3 to 4 years to make sure that that time to be able to make those strategic decisions are allowed. And we've put in place a mechanism through our rural financial counsellors, investing an additional 39 counsellors to complement the 116 to sit around kitchen tables and to help them fill out the application. We understood that the application was long and tedious. We've cut it by a third. But we've also worked with Centrelink to make sure that we can open them on Saturdays to expedite these applications to get that money into farmers' pockets. We understand the importance of giving our farmers that dignity. And that's why it's important that tomorrow the Drought Summit that the Prime Minister's called brings together a review of our drought policy, which, with all due respect, has been bipartisan since 1992, and we thank those on the other side. But we need to make sure that our drought policy for the future is fit for the future. And it's important we bring federal and state agencies, charities and industry together to work to ensure that we have the best framework to support our farmers. And we should always remember that our farming families are the cornerstone of regional and rural Australia. But it's also important to understand that the story of agriculture is still a good one. It's one of just add rain. We've taken the agricultural sector from a $36 billion industry to a $64 billion industry in just 8 years. And that's been predicated on trade agreements. But the important thing is to understand that while the drought has hit, ABARES even estimates that this year we'll still have a $60 billion industry that is contributing to the Australian economy. We should be proud of the fact that our Australian farmers produce the very best food and fibre in the world.
The Leader of the Opposition.
Thank you. My question is to the Prime Minister. Can the Prime Minister confirm that over the last fortnight his divided and unstable government has 1. Lost its majority, 2. Been divided on climate policy, 3. Voted for a white supremacist slogan, and 4. Descended into civil war over whether or not Malcolm Turnbull should go to Bali? Dr Phelps is here in the House. Can the Prime Minister please explain why Mr Turnbull is no longer Prime Minister of Australia for once?
The Prime Minister has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. I can confirm that unemployment came down to 5% in the last fortnight. I can confirm that we cut taxes for small and family businesses down to 25% in the last fortnight. I can confirm that the AAA credit rating was affirmed today, Mr Speaker, in the last fortnight. I can confirm, Mr Speaker, that this government has announced that we are going to take a big stick to the electricity companies We're not going to take a big stick to homeowners, Mr Speaker. That's what I can confirm. Mr Speaker, I can confirm that we're focused on getting electricity prices down. I can confirm that we announced $15 million to go out and support rural and regional communities this morning to ensure that those who are absolutely stricken by drought are getting the helping hand that they need. And I can confirm tomorrow that we'll be gathering together as a nation to ensure that we stay the course on our drought reparations, to ensure that we deliver the relief, that we deliver the recovery and we deliver the resilience for the future, Mr Speaker. I can confirm that our government will always be focused on the issues that matter to Australians, and we will never get locked in the suited bubble of the Leader of the Opposition.
The member for Wide Bay.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Veterans Affairs. I refer the Minister to the centenary of the Armistice on the 11th of November this year. Will the Minister update the House on the importance of commemorating the service and sacrifice of Australia's servicemen and women? What are the actions the government is taking to support our veteran community?
The Minister for Veterans Affairs.
On Armistice Day, really.
The Minister for Veterans.
On Armistice Day.
The member for McEwen will cease interjecting. The Minister for Veterans Affairs.
Well, thank you, Mr Speaker. I do thank the member for Wide Bay for his question, because he understands, indeed I believe all members understand, the importance of commemorating the centenary of the Armistice to end the Great War. And Remembrance Day is about respect and recognition. We wear our red poppies and we pause to remember the fallen. And I urge all Australians to attend a local service, to wear a red poppy and to pause for 1 minute at 11 a.m. on November the 11th. And in that minute's silence, we remember the service and the sacrifice of 416,000 Australians who enlisted, and the 62,000 who never made it home, and the thousands more who returned carrying the scars with them for the rest of their lives. So we thank them for their service, we thank their families and their loved ones for their service too. And I've said before in this place that in many ways the home front has been as important as the front line throughout our history in caring for our Defence Force personnel. And Mr Speaker, on Remembrance Day, the commemorations will be supported by our government both here and abroad. And right here in this place, you and I viewed earlier today 30,000 poppies which are on display above the marble foyer. Each poppy handcrafted with love in remembrance. And I'd say to members opposite, who I know have visited the War Memorial as well, to thank them for visiting those 62,000 poppies on the grounds of the War Memorial, which represent one person killed in the Great War each. Now, each poppy is unique and individual in its own way, and part of the more than 1 million poppies that have been made following the inspiration of Lynn Berry and Margaret Knight, who first set out to crochet just 120 poppies for the Shrine of Remembrance in Melbourne. Now, Mr Speaker, these individual poppies, I think, are a reminder to us all. We often think of our ADF members as some sort of homogenous group, when in fact we tend to only see the uniform and think that perhaps they're all the same, but they're not. They're all individuals. Someone's brother, someone's sister, someone's husband, someone's wife, son, daughter, someone's best mate. And to our current members of the Australian Defence Force, I simply say, on behalf of all members in this place, thank you for your service. You help keep us safe in an often challenging world. And on Remembrance Day, as we pause to remember the fallen, we should also pay our respects, I think, to the current serving men and women of the Defence Force and their families. Now, Mr Speaker, it was former Prime Minister Billy Hughes who made our obligations clear at the end of the World War I when he said, "Our heritage, our free institutions of government, all that we hold dear, are handed back into our keeping, stained with the blood of sacrifice. Surely, not only we, their fellow citizens, but Australians throughout the ages will treasure forever the memories of those glorious men to whom the Commonwealth owes so much, and will guard that with resolute determination the privileges for which they fought and suffered." Mr Speaker, we honour the fallen of 1918 by the way we choose to live our lives in 2018. For a century, we have kept our promise and we have remembered them, lest we forget.
The Leader of the Opposition on indulgence.
On indulgence, thank you, Mr Speaker. I acknowledge and associate the opposition with the Minister's remarks, and I acknowledge too the poppy display around the Parliament, which connects the Parliament to the Australian War Memorial. It was 100 years ago that our nation made a promise. We will remember them lest we forget. We carved that promise into our grand national memorials in our capital cities and the stone of smaller and humbler monuments in country towns and coastal villages. We made that promise to the young Australians who died, to the ones who were wounded and to the ones who came home forever changed. And ever since, around our nation, at the going down of the sun and in the morning, we repeat it to ourselves and to each other. The first Anzacs are all gone. Even those left to grow old have passed away. But we will never forget their sacrifice or their service. We must continue to give our nation's century-old promise new meaning by doing everything we can to help the next generation of Australian veterans with their return to civilian life. We will remember them lest we forget.
The Prime Minister.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. On indulgence on two matters. Firstly, thank the Leader of the Opposition for his words and the Minister. I can think, frankly, of no better demonstration that we've seen in Australia over the past week of the spirit of those who we lost 100 years ago, in the spirit of those who've been competing in the Invictus Games in Sydney over the past week. It has been truly remarkable. Jenny and the girls have been out there this week seeing the events, and the stories they've told me about courage and determination is from all the athletes, from all the countries that are represented there. And I want to thank Sydney-siders for getting behind the Games and recognising all those great athletes. And I think that's a fitting tribute as we go into Armistice Day. And on another note, Mr Speaker, I wish to congratulate the member for Curtin. I would like to recognise that she was received yesterday an honour from the United States Embassy. Member for Curtin was awarded the inaugural US Mission Award for Leadership Excellence, established to honour Eleanor Roosevelt's legacy and lifelong crusade for equality, social justice and human rights. I commend the member for Curtin, and I ask that further questions be placed on the notice paper.